one of them. Popping at the mouth or the side of his neck when he pouts, no argument, no rebuttal from. He ain't from my town, I don't know him, so I'm guessing he's a clown.
Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. So I promised I was going to do a video on developmental systems, and I'm still going to do those. But this video is just going to be the foundation. This is basically a primer for those videos. So there's some things I want you to understand as I go through this. That this video is going to be about the difference between wrestling schools and developmental programs, what the purpose of a developmental program is, and that sort of thing. So we're going to talk about wrestling schools. We're going to go through some famous wrestling schools here, just a few, obviously not all of them. But the purpose of a wrestling school, obviously, is for you to actually learn how to wrestle, to do the actual wrestling part. Another part of the wrestling school during the early days is to weed out the weak. That's one thing that is a recurring theme in pro wrestling, is essentially hazing. So it's going to be a lot of, getting the weak out. So that was one of the main goals of the wrestling school. Once you've learned the holds and do the moves, you can do a drop kick and learn how to take a slam, you get sent to a developmental program. A developmental program is usually contracted, between an employer and an employee type of contract, where a trained talent would be sent to that developmental program. Developmental programs are usually locally televised. They might not be nationally televised. They will be locally televised. And it gives the performer an opportunity to learn while working on the road. Essentially going how to go from town to town, how to locker room etiquette. How do you learn how to talk in front of an audience, how to work in front of a different audience. That's sort of the purpose of the developmental program. Often these programs would mix older talent, younger talent, and current talent. So you will have new recruits, people who are fresh out of wrestling school, they would get sent on the road. You will have people who are coming back from injuries, that would learn how to rehab. They're trying to knock off ring rust. They will often be sent to developmental. People who have weight problems, they're trying to lose weight. Recurrent legends who are coming back, again, want to shake off ring rust. And sometimes it's people who just want to reinvent themselves. You want to go do something different. You want to go off TV for a while, learn a new hold, and then come back. So the first step in this, of course, like I said, is the wrestling school. So let's go into some famous wrestling schools. So one of the craziest wrestling schools is actually the Ganya wrestling camp. There's been a lot said about it. We're going to go into a little bit of that here. I'm not going to do the entire history of it, but this is an interesting little piece that we're going to discuss as far as the AWA to give you an idea about wrestling schools. This is from PW Insider. They're doing a little bit of obituary on Vern Ganya. It says, during the 1970s, Ganya not only became the perennial and multi-time champion of AWA, of course, but also one of the most renowned trainers of all time, holding court inside of a barn that was by all accounts freezing and probably one of the worst all-time conditions to train professional wrestlers in. Ganya created one of the toughest training camps of all time. One that was so tough, Ric Flair tried to quit after he began training there. Ganya showed up at his house and allegedly threatened to kick his ass if he quit. And as the story goes, Flair was so scared of that, he went back to his training. He said, while Flair was undoubtedly the greatest all-around performer to ever come out of that camp, the others who did were, in many cases, mind-blowingly awesome and legends as well. Ricky Steamboat, Ken Patera, the Iron Sheik, Bob Backlund, Ole and Gene Anderson, and Larry Hennig. All of Ganya's trainees often had the same traits. They were beyond tough, and when it came to the science of pro wrestling and the finesse that it takes to have a great physical match, they excelled at it. So Men's Journal picked up a clip from the Ric Flair 30 for 30 where Ricky Steamboat is talking about his training camp. So let's read that. Steamboat called the camp the hardest thing I've ever done and described some of the intense workouts that Ganya would put his wrestlers through. Some of the highlights: running up and down 21 flights of stairs, doing, quote, fireman's carries with other wrestlers up those stairs, and doing 1,000 bumps, ring falls, and rope bounces, all of which left bruises and rope burns on the wrestlers' bodies. So, Vern Ganya was well known for being a bit of a taskmaster in wrestling circles. Minneapolis St. Paul magazine also did a little bit of a piece on Vern Ganya, and they talked about his training there. So here's what they said. Vern Ganya trained 144 wrestlers over the years, everyone from Baron von Raschke to Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. The class of 72 was perhaps his most talented ever. According to Ganya's son Greg, Vern Ganya's son Greg, a class of 100 quickly shrunk to just 6. Greg and his eventually tag team partner of the High Flyers, Jumpin' Jim Brunzell, Ricky Flair, Khosrow Vaziri, which is the Iron Sheik, U.S. Olympic powerlifter Ken Patera, and former NFL linebacker Bob Bruggers. These men were put through their paces in 6-hour sessions, 6 days a week, and they have an outline of their routine. Their routine will look something like this: 9 a.m., 1,000 free squats, starting with sets of 25. It was unfucking godly, remembers Greg Ganya. Guys would throw up. 10 a.m., headstands with feet on turnbuckles, shoulder presses, human bridges. 11 a.m., locking up with Vern and British wrestler Billy Robinson. 1 p.m., hitting the ropes. I tore new skin down my entire sides, Ganya says. We were black and blue for the first 3 weeks. 2 p.m., safe landings. 3 p.m., holds and counter holds. Greg Ganya got a career out of the training and a few useful life tricks too. And he says, I can break your arm so fucking quick you wouldn't know what happened. In the Ric Flair book, To Be the Man, Ric Flair and Ken Patera, and they outline how bad it was in Vern Ganya's camp. So let's read some passages from that. Vern was about to start a pro wrestling training camp and wanted only top athletes. Patera and Greg Ganya were in the class, along with another acquaintance of mine, Jumping Jim Brunzell, who later became Greg's tag team partner in the AWA and one of the Killer Bees, with B. Brian Blair in the World Wrestling Federation. There were 2 other students, Bob Bruggers, a former linebacker with the Miami Dolphins and San Diego Chargers, and Hossein Khosrow Vaziri, a great amateur wrestler from Iran, who was an assistant coach on the 1972 U.S. Olympic team. Later, as the Iron Sheik, Khosrow will become the World Wrestling Federation champion. I'd always done well at sports, so I figured that if I kept getting bigger and stronger, I could make it. But Vern told me, it's not easy being a professional wrestler. In fact, it's a task and a half. I kept looking at the floor and nodding, like I understood. But honestly, I couldn't even begin to make sense of what I was about to do. Then they have little bits and pieces from Ken Patera. This is what Ken Patera had to say. I told Rick, you were born to be in this business. This business was made for guys like you. Vern wasn't so sure. Quote, I have 5 guys training already. He said, I don't have room for 6. But he eventually agreed to put Rick through the motions with the rest of us. Our main trainer was Billy Robinson, an Englishman who had a reputation as a shooter, meaning that if a match got out of hand, he could shoot or fight for real, hook his opponent with a hold and could cripple him. Billy did most of the training, with a few assistants like the magnificent Don Morocco. We started off running along this frozen creek, slipping and sliding. I'm not exaggerating. You'd have to wear 3 sweatsuits. The only way to stay warm was to keep moving and not slow down the whole day for 6 or 8 hours. Then we jumped back to Rick. One day it was 10 degrees. The next it was 10 below. We ran around this farm, not on a track, but on a customized path that went about 2 miles. The only one who made me look good was Ken. His legs were so big from all the squatting that they were chafing together. He had to do 500 free squats, 200 push-ups, and 200 sit-ups. I never trained so hard in my life. Not once had I ever done a free squat. I hadn't done push-ups in years. I wasn't used to doing sit-ups. Then we jumped back to Ken Patera. We were doing neck bridges, calisthenics, jumping jacks, everything. Then we went to work out in the ring, which was inside one of Vern's horse barns. The horses were downstairs and the chickens were upstairs on the right. It was below 0 temperatures with 1 light bulb in the whole barn, just dangling on a wire. The slats on the barn were about 1 inch apart, so there were times when we'd show up 2, 4, 8-foot snowdrifts in the place. The chickens would be roosting on the cross beams of the barn, shitting in the ring, so we'd have to clean the mat. The ring was all broken down, and the ropes were flicked up. They should be tight because you're supposed to run off them, but these were actually drooping. Here's Vern Ganya, a multimillionaire, and he had the worst possible conditions for us to train in. Eventually, when it got unbearably cold, he did rent the St. Paul Armory for us. Finally, we had hot running water and flushing toilets. But before then, I tell you, it was bizarre. In the ring, we do 50 front rolls, then 50 back rolls. After that, we give each other 50 turnbuckle reversals, pulling a guy off one set of turnbuckles and throwing him into the set of the opposite side of the ring. Then you do 50 shoulder tackles, 50 flying mares, 50 suplexes. Fuck, it was unbelievable. When Joe Scarpello, an old-timer who had been All-American at University of Iowa, came up one day, he said, "Vern, you just took 10 years off your career." He said we took more bumps, falls in our training than he had in his 25 years in the ring. This is brutality, he told us. This is uncalled for. Then we jump back to Rick. I must have been at camp for 2 days when I quit. I called up Greg and said I'm done. I was dead. Mentally, I couldn't take it. That's Vern Gagne's camp in a nutshell. Of course, Ric Flair didn't quit. He ended up going back. But that was horrible. That's pretty bad. That's pretty bad. Stu Hart often trained wrestlers in his own basement. It came to be known as the dungeon. In the book Pain and Passion, they actually describe what the dungeon is and how bad things actually got down there sometimes. So let's go through this a little bit. It says, spread on the floor was an all too thinly padded wrestling mat, 17 by 17 feet. Its borders reinforced with wood planks, steel weights, and a barbell to keep from sliding. The mat, perhaps once white, over the years had become a putrid yellow-gray, stained with the various body fluids it had soaked up, from sweat and blood to snot and vomit. Nobody can remember a time it had been washed. The wood-paneled walls were frequently in a state of disrepair, cracked and splintered from lumbering, muscled bodies and craniums being slammed into them. The ceiling was so low that the taller wrestlers frequently smashed through it in their heads and their feet as they learned how to take high falls, body slams, and bumps. Eventually, the metal pipes became exposed, and a few times grapplers broke through those as well. At the dungeon's entrance, just off the mat was Stu's gym. Equipped with barbells, benches, dumbbells, up to 600 pounds worth, the weights which Stu had custom designed. He had a hard name engraved on the iron. Over the years, most of the weights would go missing, but when most people had never laid eyes on the simple universal weight machine, common in high school gym today, Stu's gym had a row of handmade weights and pulley contraptions, primitive by today's standards, but effective when it came to building rock-hard muscles. Once a week, the Hart Patriarch went down to the dungeon with the talent and any wannabe wrestlers trying to break into the show. Playtime was on. Stu taught the boys how to wrestle the way he had learned at the Edmonton YMCA. He stretched them, locked them in submission holds, and bending and twisting them until they screamed, cried, and vomited, thinking they were going to die. Many simply blacked out. At first, Stu toyed with the new recruits, feeling them out, casually flipping them through holds, each one more painful than the last, until the wannabe grappler was hopelessly tied up in a knot on the mat. Then Stu smothered his opponent, pinching the nose and mouth with his huge mitts until the man couldn't breathe. Panic would set in. The legs would begin to kick. Stu gave him a gasp of air, then cut off his breathing again. Stu's favorite move was known as the college ride. That's the old pro educating you about the ring, says trusted family friend Greg Everett, who was stretched on many occasions. He stuck my chin down to my chest, which pulls from the base of your tailbone all the way up your back to the tip of your head. You're blacking out at this point, going in and out of consciousness. And at the same time, he's pulling your legs apart. He'd be ripping your whole groin apart, and you could feel the little sinews snapping, like pins pricking. Your left arm would be pulled so far behind your head, it felt like your shoulder was going to break. Yeah, you were in a whole mess of pain. Most men wound up crawling out of the dungeon humiliated, whimpering like hobbled dogs, those who returned won Stu's respect, and he set about teaching them the secrets of the business, molding them into stampede wrestlers. They continued later in the book. There are countless stories of Stu taking such liberties. Right up to his final years, the stories are most often funny, but they are all also disturbing. For all his good and noble qualities, Stu had a sadistic side. Stretching wannabe wrestlers was one thing. If that's the way a grappler had to pay his dues, so be it. Wrestling was not for the meek. But when it came to punishing average Joes, curious reporters, and teens trying to date his daughters, something was definitely amiss with the Hart patriarch's behavior. Many have come to the conclusion that Stu was a bully, abusing his physical power. I thought it was bullshit, says ex-wrestler Ben Bassarab, who married Allison Hart. He never once said to a guy, listen, I'm going to take you downstairs and put you in a hold and hurt you. I'm not going to let you go. The more you scream and kick, the more I'm going to put the pressure on you. To me, that's not teaching. That's bullying. The late Lou Thez, believed by many to be the greatest wrestler of all time, was critical of Stu's methods. According to wrestling journalist Dave Meltzer, Thez claimed that, quote, Stu was great at demonstrating holds on willing participants and those without wrestling training, but not in getting top guys in them. The Hart boys reject the notion that their dad was a bully. Stu stretched people to make them appreciate wrestling, Brett says. Bruce argues that the cutting-edge wrestlers who emerged from the dungeon, the Hart boys, Archie the Stomper Goldie, Rick Martel, Brian Pillman, Chris Benoit, Lance Storm, and Chris Jericho, to name a few, were all molded in large part by Stu's methods. They paid their dues by going through the hell of the dungeon, and in turn, quote, they gave the business their best. The book, The Death of the Territories, also talked about the dungeon, and in one passage it says, in the basement of his home, known as the dungeon, is where he taught his pupils the art of submission grappling, and his graduates were not only skilled performers but capable shooters. Among his notable students were Fritz Von Erich, superstar Billy Graham, and Wilbur Snyder. He also mentored his sons Brett, Bruce, Smith, Keith, and Owen Hart, each follow suit and career path into the squared circle. So you see that the dungeon was pretty wild, and that, you know, these things serve a dual purpose: to weed out the weak, keep the strong, and to teach the business. Really, that's three purposes. I need to learn how to count. So just for kicks and giggles, we're also going to talk about two more facilities. One being the New Japan Dojo, just for a little reference. So there's a book by Chris Charlton named Lion's Pride. It discusses the history of New Japan Pro Wrestling. In it, they talk about the New Japan Young Lions system and their training system. So we're going to read a little bit of the passage here. It says, as such, prospects will sleep in the building attached to the dojo, and more than simply training a few hours a day, will also cook and clean for established talents over and above up to 11 hours of practice, mirroring the lifestyle at a sumo stable. A trainee allowed to commute into practice was a rare and often the recipient of some resentment, as was the case when Shohei Baba was allowed to live in an apartment near the JWA dojo as he trained. Hiroshi Tanahashi would live in the New Japan dojo for 4 years. Liger never left. In keeping with the New Japan Young Lions theme, the company's young stars were quickly labeled Young Lions, among their first being Tatsumi Fujinami, a student of Inoki during the JWA days, and an opening act in New Japan Pro Wrestling's early years, aged just 16. The Young Lion pattern from first training to main card status was the same in the 1970s as it would be in the 2010s. For the most part, prospects train before working preliminary matches for a certain period, and then make a foreign excursion, returning with a character to portray on TV. Even entering the dojo was a tall order. Much like WWE's system in the United States, there are stringent requirements to meet and a demanding physical tryout to clear. It's an initial hurdle many stumble at. Yoshihashi failed the initial test twice before entering the dojo after a student dropped out. Tetsuya Naito, a 2015 interview, recalled enrolling in the same tryout as Kazuchika Okada, who struggled through the training prior. Training itself is demanding to the point of danger. Hiromitsu Gonpei's death during training in 1995, being shrouded in secrecy, but allegedly being due to Kensei Sasaki's pressing the young charge too hard, extremely rigorous training, and a system of coaches verbally berating and physically assaulting trainees is commonplace in Japanese sports, and striking youngsters with kendo sticks when errors are made is not a practice limited to Satoru Sayama's infamous MMA training. The Yomiuri Giants baseball team's legendary harsh training led to the 1973 suicide of Toshihiko Yaguchi, and in the corporate world, karoshi, death from overwork, has been a very real problem in sports. There has been a gradual change in this regard, and a move to a more positive training regimen as of late. So, you can see that wrestling trainings are not for the weak at heart. And this is just stage one, which is usually, for some people, the hardest stage. So, the WWE have some affiliated organizations where they do trainings. These are just kind of like the history of 3 really good historical training camps and training schools. So let's get into 2 sort of WWE affiliated training programs. Loosely affiliated WWE training program, I should say, is completely unaffiliated, is the Wild Samoan Training Center that's run by Alpha Anawai. And because so many of his students end up in WWE, it makes sense that I would use the Wild Samoans as a pretty good example of the WWE system. There's been different incarnations of the Wild Samoan training facility. There is, the 70s, the 80s, the late 80s, and the current version. In the 70s, it was in Florida. This is where he helped train people like Hulk Hogan and Paul Orndorff and Luna Vachon and Michael Hayes. In 1980s, the training facility moved to Connecticut because the Wild Samoans was wrestling in Connecticut at the time. This is where he trained Yokozuna, Sherry Martel, Rikishi. In the late 80s, they moved it to Pennsylvania. This is where he trained Billy Kidman, Dave Bautista, Bam Bam Bigelow, and Chris Kanyon. And most recently, they moved back to Florida, and one of their graduates is actually Kona Reeves. So the Wild Samoan training facility is actually pretty well known for being the training facility that prepared Mickey Rourke for his film The Wrestler. And the training was so tough that Nicolas Cage actually was supposed to be Randy the Ram in the movie, but the training was so hard he quit, and Mickey Rourke took his place. So this is just one of and this is, again, unaffiliated, but, Sika was Alpha's tag team partner, and Sika is Roman Reigns' father, is very connected with the WWE. But the WWE did have their own contracted training facility. And so let's talk about that. Famous wrestling schools, essentially, sometimes they're attached to a wrestling promotion, like the Wild Samoans. They have their own wrestling promotion called World Extreme Wrestling. Stu Hart has his own promotion, Calgary Stampede Wrestling. Vern Ganya had his own promotion. Sometimes that's the case. Most of the time, these things are just wrestling schools, and then you get sent to a different promotion. So the WWE had their own wrestling school for a very short time. It was called the Funkin' Dojo. It was ran by Dory Funk Jr. I should tell you guys about Dory Funk Jr. If you're a little young, you have no idea who it is. Dory Funk Jr., the brother of Terry Funk, it was a former NWA World Heavyweight Champion. He was the son of a promoter, Dory Funk Sr., who ran the Amarillo, Texas promotion. During the early 30s and 40s, they inherited the promotion. He actually trained Jumbo Tsuruta, the famous Japanese wrestler, in 1972. So he has a history of training. And in 1998, he got a contract from the WWE to train wrestlers in Stamford, Connecticut, and they called it the Funkin' Dojo. This is the precursor to what is now called the Funk Conservatory. It's a different system, but it's run the exact same way. So the head trainers of the Funkin' Dojo for the WWF was Dory Funk Jr. was the head trainer. Assistants were Tom Pritchard, Terry Funk, and Pat Patterson. The kind of guys that they trained in this facility are a who's who. You had Edge and Christian, you had Ahmed Johnson, you had Tiger Ali Singh, you had Mark Henry, you had Darren Drozdov, Mark Henry, You had Sean Morley, you had Kurt Angle, Christopher Daniels, Rhino, Chris Sabin, Matt and Jeff Hardy. Pretty much everybody who came, who was on TV in like 2000 or 2001 came through the Funkin' Dojo at one point or another. And the way that the system works is that he had a specific philosophy. He had a 3-point philosophy, and I think this is very important. When he was running the Funkin' Dojo, it was number 1 focused on in-ring performance. Number 2 is focused on television, learning how to work cameras, how to actually work. Number 3, which became number 1 when he went on his own, independent, was safety, and he worked on safety to prevent injuries in the ring. So to avoid injuries, they avoided tackling. They didn't do any blows to the head, no punches, no kicks, or anything like that. They focused on calisthenics, and he saw his school as being a positive motivator to make people feel good about what they're doing. So the Funkin' Dojo was a 6-day training camp. They focused on conditioning, weight training, and aided in the promo skills. Later, and after he became independent from the WWE, Dory Funk Jr. created a system where he only accepted people with an athletic background. So he would only accept people if they did martial arts or football or something like that, because it was just easier on him. And by that point, Dory Funk Jr. was really old. Okay, so he was like really old when he was running this system. So that was the WWE's official training system. So from there, you would get sent to a developmental program. Now, the WWF's very first developmental program actually took place in Memphis. Now, there have been a lot of systems that people will say, well, that's WWE developmental. For instance, ECW would be one of those places. Puerto Rico would be another, where the WWF would send guys who were not, let's say, TV ready. They will also send them to like Smoky Mountain or something like that. So you had those kinds of systems, but it wasn't official. It was basically like a talent trade or something like that. So I wouldn't count them under developmental contracts, in those days. We say the developmental system started for the WWF around 1998 when the Funkin' Dojo was created. So everything before that was basically talent trading and, Vince bringing in people who, worked in the USWA or they worked in a small town promotion. They had a relationship with the WWE. They would buy people's contracts and different things like that, but it was never an official developmental contract. The very first developmental contract was actually in Memphis for Memphis Power Pro Wrestling, was run by promoter Randy Hales. So Memphis Power Pro Wrestling ran from April of 1998 to April of 2001. It ran out of Memphis, Tennessee. Randy Hales was the promoter. He is not a wrestler. To tell you a little bit about Randy Hales was a super fan that worked in the office. He was a former assistant of Jerry Jarrett and Jerry Lawler in Memphis. He was a big fan. He used to sell pictures when he was a kid. He started as a ring announcer and worked in the office, and eventually he became a promoter. When USWA looked like he was going to be on the rocks because both Jerry Jarrett and Jerry Lawler both backed out, Randy Hales took over. So for the latter part of the USWA, which includes him having a piece of The Rock, the Flex Cabana in USWA. He actually booked The Rock in USWA. So he had a relationship with the WWE through what he had done with The Rock, and through Jerry Lawler and Jerry Jarrett, who of course worked in WWF when they thought that Vince McMahon was going to go to prison. So he was a perfect guy to send talent to because he wanted to start his own promotion. So Memphis Power Pro Wrestling actually started because USWA had gone out of business. What took place is Jerry Jarrett pretty much sold his piece of the business to Jerry Lawler. Jerry Lawler then sold pieces of the business to other people. Let's just say outsiders. I don't want to get into any details. Those outsiders were not people that Randy Hales wanted to do business with. So he kind of stepped back. Those people ran the USWA into the ground. And then Randy came back to the TV channel, Channel 5 in Memphis, and said, hey, I got this idea to run this wrestling promotion. They gave him money, was able to pay for his production costs. He then got that contract from WWE, and he was able to start this own wrestling promotion called Memphis Power Pro Wrestling, and it ran for 3 years. So it was a good system, very rudimentary. It started the standard of developmental in WWE, which is to mix legends or older talent / signed talent, and new recruits. For instance, if you look at the roster of Memphis Power Pro Wrestling, you will see guys who have actually been on WWF TV already, like Rikishi. He was wrestling there as JR Smooth. And then you had somebody like Kurt Angle, who was coming straight from the Funkin' Dojo, that was sent to Memphis Power Pro Wrestling. And he's actually probably the most famous guy to go through that area, outside of the people who are local legends like Jerry the King Lawler. He was also responsible for booking Matt Bloom, who is now the main trainer in NXT. Also, Brian Kendrick and Bryan Danielson, aka the American Dragon. So this was, of course, near the end because those guys were not that old. But it would be like in 2001 or 2000 or something like that when Brian Kendrick and Bryan Danielson would come through. So it ended up losing its place. So Memphis Power Pro Wrestling ended up losing its contract to WWE, mainly because Jerry the King Lawler, who was the one vouching for Randy Hales and Memphis Power Pro, ended up getting offended and leaving. Now, the reason he ended up getting offended and leaving is because of a shoot interview that was done in front of people with Doug Gilbert and Tommy Rich. So there's a write-up of it, kind of a description of what took place on Grantland. I'm going to read that for you. So it says, the old-timers were huffing outside the ring, and Brown was there with the microphone. First, Rich took the mic and tore into Spellbinder, the conspicuously muscled big man, saying he'd be 110 pounds without all the steroids he'd taken. Pretty standard work to shoot fair. Then Gilbert took over, and things went from reality-tinged to really fucked up. He explained that people always ask him why Brian Christopher is so successful, why he had so many championship runs, and that the secret was that Christopher's father was area kingpin Jerry Lawler. Probably the most poignant part, the moment you knew this was going off the rails, was when Gilbert prefaced the tirade by saying, "You know, Dave, there's things we aren't supposed to talk about here. They told me a few things in the back I couldn't talk about, but I don't really remember what those was." He said that the only reason promoter Randy Hales hadn't cut off his mic was because Hales was up in the control room smoking crack. Then Gilbert mimed the lighting of a crack pipe. And he said that he'd heard that Jerry Lawler had threatened to put his fist in Gilbert's mouth, and that he'd never say something that corny. He'd just say that Jerry Lawler raped a 13-year-old girl. So that was it. That was pretty much it. So Doug Gilbert had said this stuff about Jerry Lawler because Brian Christopher and Spellbinder had been making fun of Doug Gilbert's parents. It was just all part of the angle. You know, imagine similar to the DX NWO style skits where they were making fun of people's, making fun of, like when Arn Anderson got made fun of about being an alcoholic, or DX dressed up like the Nation of Domination. That's kind of what they were doing. But Doug Gilbert took the skits about his parents actually personally. And then in retaliation, he took a shot at Jerry Lawler. But it was a completely different type of shot. And Jerry Lawler took that personally. And that essentially is what ended the territory. Of course, this was an allusion to the 1993 rape case that Jerry the King Lawler underwent. He almost lost his job in WWE because of it. Grantland continues. The Hale thing was too bizarre to countenance. But the rape thing, well, that was another story. A teenage girl had actually accused Lawler of rape, and even though she recanted her story, many Memphis wrestling fans knew Lawler's history of dating much younger blondes, and this lent an uncomfortable credence to the story. Regardless, this wasn't the kind of thing wrestlers said on air, even in a shoot interview. So, the blowback from this was pretty severe. Grantland continues. Perhaps needless to say, Gilbert was fired. Some have claimed that Lawler himself drove to the studio and demanded a copy of the tape of the show, presumably to use as evidence to sue Hales and Gilbert. He never filed suit, supposedly because there was no money to be won. Power Pro Wrestling was out of business soon. Perhaps coincidentally, inspectors cracked down on the promotion's ramshackle studio space and insufficient insurance. The amount of money it would have taken to get the place up to code was daunting. Plus, Gilbert and Rich started a rival promotion. And needless to say, Lawler withdrew his endorsement of Power Pro. It's unclear if he technically a co-owner of the promotion, though he was often regarded as such. He was probably given a stake for his nominal involvement. All right, so this was the end of Memphis Power Pro Wrestling. The WWE would take their developmental deal to Terry Golden, who runs Memphis Championship Wrestling, which was the TV show was called Kick-Ass Wrestling. It was essentially a ripoff of ECW. It's awful. The less said about it, the better. And plus, I didn't find a lot of information on it anyway. But this is the kind of stuff you can look forward to as I do these developmental video plays. But this is just a primer. So what I went through here is kind of what I'm going to do in other videos. Tell you who started it, with their, if I can find their philosophy of training, I will do that. Some of the people who went through there, maybe some other things that took place as well. And just to give you an idea of what these videos could possibly be like, and to give myself an idea what these videos could be like. So thank you guys for listening. Like this video, share this video, subscribe to the channel, donate to this channel. Thank you guys for your time, and I'll talk to you guys later.
Skin tone, so why attach yourself and piggyback the wealth you didn't earn or lack yourself? I'm telling you to own up to your own success and failures. It's a reason why